Hello everybody and welcome to the Karten Network's first ever webinar. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar, and we hope that you find it really enjoyable and beneficial. Just to let you know a few things before we start, all delegates will be in listen only mode. If you ask questions as the webinar proceeds, then we'll try and answer those as we go along, but rest assured any questions that are asked at the unanswered by the end of the session, we will deal with if we're not quite able to deal with them all as they are as they crop up. As far as the webinar is concerned, there will be a recording available after the session, and it will be really helpful to us so that we can improve our webinar programme, for you to give us some feedback after today's webinar and after the others if you indeed participate in the others. And if you've got any ideas for future events, or you would like to participate as a presenter in a future webinar, please don't hesitate to let us know. Just email me. I'm Dawn. The email address is dawn@karten-network.org.uk, but that will be on the materials later on, and I'll make sure that you have that after the webinar too. So I thought that it would be useful just to give you a little bit of information about the network, a bit of news from the network before we hand over to Phil, who's our guest presenter today, Phil McIntyre, who's the lead assistive technologist at Beaumont College. So we'll just go through a few updates from the network and then hand over to Phil. So just a reminder that existing centres can apply for additional funding every 3 years up to a maximum level of £25,000, and the next opportunity to do that is at the trustees meeting in March 2018. If you wish to apply for additional funding, then the deadline for the March meeting is the 19th of January. And if you could let me know in advance, please, if you are planning on applying, that will enable me to support you to the best of my ability. We've got a newsletter coming up. We're planning on publishing a newsletter before Christmas, and so I invite you for contributions to the Christmas newsletter, articles, success stories, case studies, and we thought we'd have a silly section with some really bad Christmas cracker jokes, you know, so something hopefully that your students and service users can enjoy. There's also a Christmas card competition going on, so that we can choose the 2018 Karten e-Christmas card. If your students or service users are working on any artwork or design on the run-up to Christmas, they can send that through, and if they could let me have entries by the 6th of January, 12th night, then we can make sure that we've got those entries for judging for next year. So we invite stills or animations, and it can just be a digital image of original artwork, and we guarantee that absolutely everybody who submits an entry will get a certificate of participation, and then later in the year we'll announce the winner and of course use those e-cards when it gets to Christmas next year. I thought it would be good to let you know about a project that the Karten Network is involved in as the UK partner of Horizon 2020, which is a transnational project with partners from Spain, Italy, Israel and ourselves in the UK. A number of our Karten centres are involved in testing and development of a piece of software called VoiceIt, which translates unintelligible speech. And it looks like it's going to be really, really helpful for people who often people find it difficult to understand what they're saying. So this is a great opportunity for anybody that might like to be involved in testing and developing this particular software. Again, if you want to get in touch with me, then I can let you have more information about that project. Right, okay. We are now going to hand over to Phil. If you just give me a second, I'm going to transfer the presenter rights to Phil, and he's going to take us through the next part of the webinar. Hope you enjoy it.
Hi everyone, sorry, just taking care of microphones and muting and things like that. As Dawn mentioned, I'm Phil McIntyre. I'm the lead assistive technologist at Beaumont College. I'm not going to bore you with details about me, apart from to say at Beaumont we run a small team of assistive technologists, as myself and two others. And we interface really heavily with the other teams, therapy teams, and the technology team in college. And there'll be more about that later. If you want to find out about me and how I'm qualified to talk about all this stuff, just go on LinkedIn and look at my profile, and you'll find out about where I've worked and what I've done. And that's the easiest way around it, rather than boring you now. So today we're going to just divide up the webinar into three sections around assessment. First of all, we're going to talk about the process, the way in which we do things, and maybe the order in which we do things, possibly. We're going to have a bit of a section looking at equipment. I'll show you around the assessment room that I'm currently sat in, and we'll have a look at some of the kit we use. I'm not going to go into great detail about which piece of kit does what, because that's not really what this webinar is about. But I'll touch on the range, because I think that's important, the range of kit that we have here for assessment. After that, I'm going to talk a bit about the techniques we might use, and this will involve a couple of case studies of real students who've been here at Beaumont. And two extremes really, one fairly straightforward assessment, if you like, and one that's a bit more complex, just to give you an idea of the range of students and the different ways in which we might handle those assessments. And finally, hopefully, if I don't talk for too long, I'm going to make sure you've got time for questions at the end. If you have burning questions as we're going along, please do put them up in the chat box as we're going along, because I'll get to them, but I can't promise to get to everyone instantly. But if I can, I'll answer your question there and then. But if I can't, then I'll try and deal with it at the end. Is that better for the microphone? Someone's just said that they can't hear me very well. I think that's up about as high as it will go. So hopefully you can hear better now. Okay, so process first, then equipment, then techniques. So before we get to all of that, there's a greater consideration that is an umbrella over all of what we're talking about today, and that's the one of context. And I've found in the past that this is something that people often forget when they're doing assessments. People get really concerned about, well, we need to find the right piece of kit, we need to find the right technique, we need to find the right pieces of software for this individual, and forget about the context. So, for instance, at Beaumont College, we know that when students come here, the reason that they're wanting assistive technology is primarily to support their study. And from a straightforward point of view, that's also why we're getting paid by their local authority, is to support this, for them to be able to study the subjects they've agreed to. And as an assistive technologist, that's my primary role, is to make sure that that happens, that they can do their studies and they aren't disadvantaged, and the technology is there to support them. But alongside that, and primarily this is for our residential students, but it is more for it is also for day students. We're looking at whether that person can use technology to help their independence, whether they can use that to help their social engagement, and they're the kind of soft skills, if you like, that wrap around the study skills and the studying that they're doing while they're here. So those all tie into that. We're also looking at the context of where that individual is going to be in the future. Now, this is often hard to judge, especially in the early days of someone being here, but definitely in that student's final year, with everything, but also with the technology that we're talking about today, we're focusing on how are they going to use this once they leave college? What setting are they going to move into? Is it realistic to give that individual a really high-end, high-tech piece of kit, and then it not able to be used once they've left because they don't have the support that they require around them? So, overarching all of this, whatever kit we're looking at, we should be thinking, right, where are they going to use it? How are they going to use it? And that context. So please keep that in mind, and obviously your context may well be quite a lot different from Beaumont College. And I make no apology that I'm going to talk today about what we do at Beaumont College and how we do it at Beaumont College. But hopefully you'll be able to apply that to your setting. And obviously I have worked in lots of other settings, so I can take questions or follow-up questions after the webinar about how that might apply to a totally different setting. What you'll also find when we're talking about the process today is there are lots of ideals, and I make no apology for that, but I do admit it. I'll talk a lot about multidisciplinary working with different therapists, and I realise that in your particular setting, that might not be true. You might not be able to draw on all of those resources. However, that doesn't distract from the fact that we should always see that as an ideal, that we can call on that if need be. Okay, so let's get started with a bit of the process then. What we're going to do is instead of boring you with PowerPoint, I'm going to talk you through a couple of things. The first one is a process mind map. I just don't know what came on, sorry, because I put the wrong thing. Here we go. So let's just switch my screen to here. Yeah, I don't think you can see that. So application, sorry, let's get the right one. Here we go. So you should now be able to see mind map on your screen. And this is something that I made a while back, just it's a bit like a flowchart, but it's not necessarily all in order. But ideally, this would be the way we follow through 1 to 4, and then with some lines back. And I'm just going to talk through this a little bit when we talk about the process that happens here. So the first thing we would do when we're looking at an individual is we try and find as much as we can out about their background. So we'll look at their previous tech use. A lot of individuals come to us straight from school, or maybe with a gap in the middle, but generally they've got a lot of notes and recording from when they've been at school. So we'll look at that documentation. If something's unclear, we often will try and get in touch with the staff at school and say, well, we're not quite sure what this means, but how did this work out in practice? And that's been incredibly helpful in the past. A conversation, you know, a 20-minute conversation on the phone can make up for having to read reams and reams of paper. And some of this stuff isn't possible to write down, and sometimes when you probe a bit deeper, you get a bit more detail. So that can be very useful. We're also, as I said, we're looking at the context. We're looking at their educational goals whilst they're at Beaumont College. What do they need to achieve? and what is the context in which that's going to happen. At Beaumont, before a student comes here, they will always have an intake assessment, and so sometimes this is one day, sometimes it might be as much as 24 hours if they're a residential student, where they will meet with a range of therapists and educationalists. Unfortunately, as assistive technologists, we don't get a look in at that point, primarily because their timetable is so full. We don't want to overload the students. But what we do is we get all of those intake assessments, and we will consider that when we're getting our background information. And primarily for us, we find the most useful ones to be from the speech and language therapists, and also from the occupational therapists, who would have done very detailed assessments and spent a lot of time with that individual before they start. So then, once the students started at college, we'll have initial a face-to-face assessment, which doesn't necessarily just happen in one block. We will make sure we observe that individual, and if they do use any technology currently, we'll make sure we try and observe them using that tech. Now, students start here day one, they're into teaching sessions, and they're going at it and interacting with other students, interacting with the technology, and interacting with tutors. So as assistive technologists, our first week probably is taken up with making sure all of the students on our caseload, we've gone round and we've spent at least 20 minutes observing them in that setting without any intervention whatsoever, and taking notes on that. Dependent on the student, we'll have conversations with that individual about what technology they've used in the past, what they want to get out of their technology use, if they've got any frustrations about stuff they're using already. Obviously, that's not appropriate for all students, but for those who can engage in that, then we will we'll make sure we have that conversation with the student. If the student is currently a user of a PC or a Mac, we'll work through our IT assessment document. So I'll just pull that up for you now so you can see that. 1 second. Too many documents here. So put this in the basic view so you can see it. Now, this is a really quite broad form, and broad for good reason, because I'm of the opinion that you could fill a form up with tick boxes for all of the possibilities that might occur when you're doing an assessment, and you'll have missed one or two, so you won't have the relevant tick box when it happens. So I'll just quickly talk you through this access assessment. Obviously, we're saying, have we read the students' intake information, making sure that people have observed the students for at least 20 minutes, made some notes before they actually meet with the student, or do a kind of face-to-face assessment of the equipment that they might like to need to take with them. And then, as I say, this is quite broad, but it's things like, can they learn to use a mouse? If they can use a standard mouse, joystick, trackball, touchscreen. Sometimes that's really obvious. Sometimes students come to us with their preferred technology, or they've used it in the past, and they can identify that. And in a minute, when we talk about kit, we'll see the range that we have. Same with the keyboard. We're looking at whether that individual needs a different type of keyboard, whether they use a standard one. A really kind of basic literacy test. Obviously, we've probably got a lot of background information previously on that individual's level of literacy, but there's no point in knowing that a learner can use a keyboard if they can't use it effectively. You know, if they've no idea about the letters, then we need to be looking at maybe a dual approach of getting them to use that keyboard along with some literacy training, which we'll be talking to the tutors about. Things like the standard Windows settings. So, does the individual need a change in the size of pointer on the screen? Do they need a larger font? Do they need a screen tint or a different colour scheme? All the kind of things you can change within Windows or within the Mac operating system. And we can make those changes now. And this is something that we would do there and then. So if we find out, we make those changes, see if the student benefits, and then those changes will stick with their profile. Just a quick side note on that, we run roaming profiles here at Beaumont. So if we make changes to that student's profile while they're logged on to that machine, then those changes will follow them around. Apologies to some of you if this is standard practice, but I find the more I go around, the more I find out that people aren't following roaming profiles. Roaming profiles is one of the biggest accessibility changes you can make in your organisation, which means that if someone needs a large mouse pointer, wherever they log on, they can still get that large mouse pointer. These things are getting easier and easier. If you need more information on that, get in touch with me afterwards. Then some notes again about the kind of technologies that we think the learner could benefit from. Sometimes again this is as a result of conversations with the individual. Now we get to what I would call really the meaty bit is of the software that you're actually trying with that individual. So it might be that you're trying something specific out. So if you think that individual needs voice recognition, or they're trying a head mouse or some eye gaze, well, what did you do? Detailed notes about the exact piece of software you trialed, the way the settings were, all of the stuff that's going to be useful later. Sometimes this can be as simple as typing into a Word document as part of a task in a session, and you observe them doing that. But if it's something more complex like setting up with eye gaze, then you're going to need some detailed notes in there. If the learner's in a wheelchair, obviously there's additional things that you need to consider. So position of the device, so if you're using the keyboard, well, do they have a wheelchair tray? Can a keyboard fit on the tray? Can you get the keyboard on along with a mouse or along with another device? And then just some other notes, different pieces of software, word prediction, simple software, whether the individual might need headphones. Lately, obviously, we've added preferences for iPads or other tablets. More and more students we're finding are not interested or not bothered about using a PC or a Mac, but they're very happy to use an iPad. And therefore we'll try and, as far as we can, to get all of their curriculum-based work based on an iPad, if that is the format that they prefer, whether that's to do with the access of the iPad or they just prefer that as a medium. And again, we're thinking then, do we need to make any changes to the iPad to enable access? So then important boxes at the bottom, any follow-up actions required, giving some limits on what you're going to do, the dates you're going to do them by. And then another few tick boxes. So if we think there needs to be further involvement from speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, we need the IT team to do something in the background to make their profile work properly or something like that. Or anyone else that we need to involve. We're also, there's a box there which says discuss at COP. Now we have a meeting every 2 weeks that we call Community of Practice, and that involves speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, physio, speech and language therapy assistants, and assistive technologists, and a key tutor. And that's mainly around students using augmentative communication devices, but all students tend to get discussed at one point. And that tends to be a really good forum for just getting everyone in the same room and talking over if there's been any issues with that student's technology, if there's been any issues with their engagement, and getting all the ideas out of the room. So if we think that that assessment needs to be discussed at that community of practice, we will do that. Okay, I'm just aware I'm talking lots and time's getting on. So let's jump back to our assessment process. So once we've done that face-to-face assessment, then we're thinking about what other input do we, oh sorry, one thing, last thing to mention on that, those recommendations will be written up, and then depending on the technology that that student needs, we'll write some setup protocols. So if there's a how and why and their positioning, we'll produce a document with photographs, we'll produce videos if necessary for setup, so that members of staff working with that individual know what to do, what to plug in where, and how to set it up and what software to use, etc. So then, if necessary, occupational therapy input. So for a switch user, that might be a more intense assessment, and we'll look at one of those later. For a keyboard or mouse user, we're checking on positioning, we're checking on things like wheelchair trays. For, say, an eye gaze user, we're making sure that the occupational therapists are aware of the positioning. We get all our OTs to do the mounting of any devices. If devices need mounting to wheelchairs, the occupational therapists do it primarily because they're the ones that are insured and they're the ones that are covered to do it. We will work with them to advise, but the actual the final decision is signed off by them. Speech and language therapy, obviously, generally they've been involved already. If the person's a communication aid user, speech and language therapy will know them and they will be involved to a high degree. But if we, as assistive technologists, suspect that they may benefit from AAC, that's when we'll be talking to speech and language therapists. For anyone who's a symbol user or who has more complex ways of interacting with text and with visuals, we'll get speech and language therapy involved as well, because we're thinking about the appropriateness and the level at which resources need to be presented to that individual. That brings us to number 4, which is ongoing assessment. So it doesn't stop after that point. We by no means have a one-stop shop. For some people, it could be the case of getting it sorted and then they're off and they're running, and then we see them very rarely and we check in regularly after that with them. But for others, it might be a long then series of ongoing assessments, more observations, regularly checking those protocols set up are working, gathering feedback from all members of staff, tutors and learning support. If they're a residential student, we're looking at what they're doing in the evening and how well that technology is working for them. For students with really complex requirements, then we're from that point, from after the initial assessment, we're looking at timetabling in regular assessments. Generally, they're multidisciplinary, so an occupational therapist or speech and language therapist will be involved alongside us and making sure that maybe, so for instance, someone's learning a new skill, then we'll make sure that they've got, I don't know, 3 periods of 20 minutes a week to practice that skill and to develop it more if necessary. As part of that ongoing assessment, the SLT might have said, all right, they're fine, they're ongoing, but we've always got the opportunity to refer back to the SLT if there's any problems. We've always got the opportunity to refer back to the occupational therapist if necessary. Now, as I said at the beginning, I'm aware that for some of you, you may not have this staffing and this therapy resource on site, and I'm aware that we're very, very fortunate to have that. But hopefully there's those professionals that you can draw on, whether that's NHS or whether that's community-based therapist. Okay, so that brings us to the end of that kind of assessment mind map. I'm going to jump back now, switching around about this, sorry, to my presentation, just keep me in line. And now we're going to have a bit of focus on equipment. So, if you'll bear with me so I can just get my single webcam. So I'm going to show you around our assessment room. I'll try not to move the camera too much because it's inclined to make people seasick, but this is our assessment room. I'll move very slowly round here. Trying to stay near the microphone. Okay, so you might notice initially, I'm trying to go around in a full circle here, that it's a bit plain, it's a bit boring on the walls, and that is absolutely deliberate. When I arrived at Beaumont into this role, someone had very nicely and with great intention put up some lovely posters on this wall in front of me, the first things I did was take them down, because when students are in this room and they're undergoing an assessment or they're working on something, the last thing we want is for them to be distracted. So all of this equipment that you see out here that I'm going to talk about in just a second is not normally here. It's normally tucked away in cupboards. We've got quite a few decent sized cupboards here and storage for all our kit. So that's not normally there. You can see the other end of the room is quite plain. I've even been known to take down that clock and take it out of the room because the ticking was really loud. Once you get a quiet room, ticking clock can be the most annoying thing. So what we'll do is we'll use this room for assessments when we need to take students out of the standard setting, out of the teaching sessions. And that's quite deliberate. I'll focus a bit more on that later. Let's just have a little bit of a chat about equipment. So if I can position this camera without making you feel, let's leave it up there and so I'll talk loud so that you can still hear me. So we've got a wide range of kit here that we use. We talked about alternative keyboards, alternative mice and things like that. So things like large keyboards, high contrast keyboards, keyboard mounts, keyboards that are a bit more compact. This one's quite useful. They've got on a wheelchair tray so you can still get a mouse on and things like that. As I said, I'm not going to focus on the ins and outs of these too much, but a wide range of mice and joysticks, trackpads, mice with one button, things like that, so that we've got hopefully a solution that we need for a student when they're undergoing an assessment. Now it might be that we don't have the perfect solution. There's loads of this kind of kit out there. There's probably at least tens of different types of big rollable like this, and tens of different big joysticks. But it means that we can at least get an idea of what that person can do with it, and we can tweak the software as necessary. So it's important to have, I feel, to have a wide range of that kind of kit. We've also got obviously a wide range of switches that we use with students when they're undergoing switch assessments. Really helpful stuff like these Manfrotto arms, which I'm sure a lot of you will use already, but the ability to be able to get this into any position I want and any angle I want, so that for a student to be able to access it is really useful as an assessment tool. Long term, I wouldn't be necessarily wanting to use this, because part of the issue is with it, its advantage is also its disadvantage, if you see what I mean. Because I can move it a lot, then I don't also always necessarily get it in the exact position the next time I set it up. So we'll do photographs and things like that, but ideally, once a student has settled on a switch position that they can access, then we'll try and get the switch mounted on something that's a bit more rigid and permanent and can just be slotted in to the right place. So their switch is always in a consistent place for them. There's a range of other stuff in here. You'll notice we've got a large screen here that we use for controlling. Now this, yes, we do use it as a TV, but we're using that when we're training students to use environmental control. So if their device needs to operate a TV and they haven't got a TV, or they don't, are they on residential at college, then we can get them using this one and get them trained up on that. We've got other stuff that we're currently playing with and experimenting with, things like Amazon Echo. This is going to be a really useful tool, so we can do things like, say, Echo, and of course it's not working because Alexa, no, it's nicely lost the Wi-Fi just as I'm going to demonstrate to you. Echo, no, all right, let's skip that. Turn on Disco Ball. Oh, she's not playing. Always when you try and demonstrate something. So, bring the webcam back. So what I'm trying to get across with this, rather than showing you how much stuff we've got and isn't it great, I'm not trying to show off, but what I'm trying to do is say that if you want to do assessments for a wide range of individuals, you're also going to need a wide range of kit. And it's having that at your fingertips, or rather having that in a cupboard that you can quickly grab, is essential. And one thing we find that's trickier is when we go out to do assessments. So we've got 3 other campuses at Beaumont that we call satellites. And as assistive technologists, we need to go out and assess the students there as well. So we are then making sure we take kit with us that might be relevant to that individual, and making sure we've got all that with us. And that brings me back to the point of observation and reading the background information before doing the assessment. Really seeing the assessment as much more than a one-stop shop, a one-step process, that you need that background information so that you know the relevant equipment and to take to the assessment, so that you can give that individual a decent chance to interact. So let's leave the kit for now, I think, because we're just going to jump forward to more practice-based stuff. So let's go to the slideshow, which we're still in. Oh, come on. Slideshow. Okay. So we're going to talk techniques now about how we might go about delivering an assessment for an individual. I've got 2 case studies of 2 different complexities. So let's jump to, I did it on this. Let's jump to the first case study. Now this is fairly straightforward. It's an individual who uses a PC, uses a keyboard and mouse, and was what we would call quite a straightforward assessment. But even though it's straightforward, you see I've written an awful lot about it. But I'm trying to map this onto, for this individual, onto the same mind map that I showed you before about the process, to show you the steps we would go through with a particular individual. So this is Nikki, and her background information, previous tech use while she was at school. Well, there wasn't that much actually, to be honest. There was general comments about technology use, so that we knew that she was capable of doing that, but no detail of access requirements or adjustments that were made for her. We looked at the context, all important context, her educational goals while she was at Beaumont College. So she wanted to develop her functional skills, and PC use was a big part of that. So things around letter writing, emailing, having skills for work and future employment, and PC use again is a big part of that. Alongside that, she's studying dance and she's studying music, which are less tech heavy, but still that might have an impact on the way she wants to interact with those subjects and the work she might have to do to support that. We had a lot of information from our intake assessments. From the SLT, we know that she's got a good level of understanding, can follow verbal instructions well with some simplification. Her speech is very clear. From the OT, we know that her cerebral palsy and scoliosis affect movement in her left hand and down her left side. Her reach is quite limited, and she's got reasonable fine motor skills if her hands are close to her body. So that's a good amount of information before we start working with Nikki and talking to her about what she wants to do and how she can interact and use the technology. So initially observed Nikki using a standard keyboard and mouse in our lovely Karten suite at college. We talked to Nikki about what tech she's used before. Your primary source of information obviously should be the student if at all possible. And she just said that she'd used a standard mouse and keyboard and she got on okay with it. So we went through the assessment document that I showed you before. That's doubly useful. It gives us a method of recording what we've done, but it also is, a lot of times when you do an assessment, it's really important to have a structure and to go into that assessment with some sort of structure. It may not be as formal as the one that I've shown you, it may be more formal, but you can't afford to go in and just be shooting in the dark. Let's try a bit of this, let's try a bit of that. You've got to give yourself a structure to work on. So we tested various things. Nikki tried a rollerball, she tried a joystick, a trackpad, she tried a large keyboard, she tried a high contrast keyboard. And after all of that testing, she came down and she said she preferred a standard mouse and a standard keyboard. She tried the alternatives. She'd had the opportunity to do that, and she tried that. So the only recommendations that we made out of that were that making sure that the mouse and keyboard were able to be placed on Nikki's wheelchair tray, which was a recommendation obviously from the OT reports that we had earlier, saying she needed limited reach, she's not going to reach out to a desk, she always needed her tray in place. And because of that, we provided Nikki with a compact keyboard so that she had room on her wheelchair tray, otherwise there's not room for a full-size keyboard and to move a mouse around. So we gave her a compact keyboard that she could carry around with her, and then she can use the standard computer mouse for any machine that she's using. We also made sure for Nikki that we had a spare of the keyboard in case she forgot to bring it with her one day or it got lost or broken. We've always got a backup for her there. So following that, made sure that we liaised with occupational therapists and said, can you just come and observe Nikki while she's using the keyboard and mouse and just check the amount of, whether the positioning's right from an OT perspective, whether the amount of effort she's using is right. And that all went fine. We didn't need any speech and language therapy input in this particular case for Nikki. So brings us to ongoing assessment, making sure that we regularly check back in with Nikki. Now, the way we work here is that assistive technologists are regularly in teaching sessions. They're in and out of teaching sessions the whole time. So we can make sure that we observe Nikki and check that. We will get feedback from tutors and learning support and from key workers if things aren't working. And we make sure that we encourage people, say, when introducing technology, we say to all those key people around them, if there's any problems, come straight back to us. One of the observations that came back initially, despite Nikki not having a problem with it during the assessment, was that she was struggling to see the mouse. And maybe something in her vision had changed in a few weeks. So we simply enlarged the mouse pointer. But without the observation of those tutors and learning support, Nikki might have been struggling somewhat with that. Okay, so that's Nikki. I'm going to quickly jump to a more complex individual here, just to make sure we have time for questions at the end. So this is Reese, and he, when he came to us, he's got, well, let's start from the beginning. Let's do the proper thing. So we know from Reese's background, as far as we know, he didn't use any technology at school. As you'll see later, I had a quick chat with Reese about it, and he said he'd never used anything previously to control technology. His educational goals, his context while he's at BC, Beaumont College, were increasing his social engagement, being able to make choices actively, increasing his IT skills, and using environmental controls to influence his environment. From his intake assessments, we had a lot of information. Reese has cerebral palsy, is a wheelchair user, he's got a visual impairment, very limited vision, and short-sighted, so much so that looking at a photograph, he couldn't differentiate between the people in that photograph. And also has spinal scoliosis. From the SLT, we know that he uses speech very effectively to communicate, but that speech can be sometimes unclear if you don't know him. From the OTs, likely requirement for a tray on his wheelchair that he didn't have, and that to control his arms, he needs to be in exactly the right position in his wheelchair, and that was really critical to the way in which he interacts with technology and with the world in general. So, initial observations as part of our face-to-face assessment. There wasn't really much to observe, to be honest, because Reese had never used much technology before and therefore came in without much in place. And we didn't have any independent use of technology to observe. The only technology which we could observe was the fact that he had an iPad which with a Facebook page, and he would ask staff to read out his Facebook posts. So, but far from independent at that stage. So, quick conversations with Reese initially. As I mentioned before, he said he never used anything, but we asked him what he would like to do, what he would like to use technology to control, and he said he would like to send emails, and he'd like to be able to control his music, which is a big motivator for him, a big area of interest. So we started off a range of trials that are a lot more complicated. Things like that we might typically turn to in terms of control, like eye gaze, were not an option due to Reese's vision. So we're looking at switch use. We tried head switching. We had very good head control, but we had to discount this, and this was primarily because Reese is a very sociable person, and the minute anybody talked, he would turn towards them. And that's a bit of a disadvantage when you're trying to use a head switch, because you'll just have accidental use. So we found out that his hands were most reliable. We set up a switch on a 45-degree angle. Again, this is all part of, as you'll see later, part of joint assessments with the occupational therapist. This isn't just me carrying out this assessment. This is occupational therapist being involved right from the beginning. So we started off just some really simple triggering music with cause and effect. Now, Reese's understanding is way beyond cause and effect, but what we wanted to do was keep it straightforward so that we could establish a really reliable and accessible switch position for him. It's really important to not increase someone's cognitive load or overload them cognitively when you're trying to solve a physical issue. So with the individual's agreement, then it's really good to be able to say, look, I know this is really easy, I know this is really simple, and you can do this really well, but I just want you to be able to do this one thing so that we can get the physical side set up. And that was really important, and Reese was really happy to do that. Lots of documentation of that, the photos and videos, photos of where we did it right, photos of where we did it wrong, and videos, importantly, of where it went right. Video can be a really good assessment tool, and it's a really good assessment tool for where things go wrong, I think, because you can revisit that video when you're not distracted by trying to set stuff up and going wrong, and then maybe you can see some things on that video that you didn't see in the situation. Maybe, if need be, you can get another professional involved in that and say, just have a look at this, tell me what you think. It'd be really useful. So recommendations for that are written up. Obviously, a lot of occupational therapy input there. We got speech and language therapy involved because we thought that Reece may benefit from AAC, but because his speech was very good and because his access and his method of control was developing, speech and language therapists thought that, well, actually, it's going to be harder for him to operate a speech output device than it is just to make himself understood with his voice. And Reece was perfectly happy with that too. So for ongoing assessments, as I said before, multidisciplinary timetabled assessments for Reece started off 3 20-minute sessions once a week, 3 20-minute sessions a week, sorry, for him to increase his switch use. We gradually introduced that switch use into teaching sessions so that he had opportunities to use it in a more meaningful way. And then we would stop in and observe that as regularly as possible. Feedback from tutors was really useful because they were coming up with ideas of how Reece could use that to support his studies and how we could integrate that switch use meaningfully into his educational goals. If you remember back at the beginning of this, Reece said he wanted to be able to control his music. He wants to be able to choose when to start and stop his music and to do things like that. So we set up for Reece a scanning environmental control system in his bedroom in college. Fortunately, he's in a bedroom with lots of devices that he can access. So he then could open his curtains, he can open his door, he can choose his TV channel on his own TV, and he can start, stop, and skip music on his stereo. And that was really important to him. Previous to that, he would, if he was in his room on his own, he would have to shout a member of staff and get them in, just to be able to change a track on music. Because of that, he had to have his door open the whole time. So if he wanted to, he didn't have the privacy that he required. So being able to open his door with requiring then staff to come, knock on his door, wait for him to open it. Really, really powerful stuff for someone who hasn't been able to do that before. Okay, so sticking with the process here, sorry, feedback from key workers and support staff. We're asking for observations on all of this stuff, and we as assistive technologists are doing regular checks on these protocols. We've got a feedback loop here, always coming back to occupational therapy. So whenever there's a tricky issue that Reece is coming across that he lets us know about or that we observe, we're getting occupational therapy involved in them and having the discussion and saying, you know, what do you think about this? How's this going to work out? Okay, right. Let's crack on back to our PowerPoint. We're going to ask quickly some key questions about assessment. Now, I've always been taught when you want to know about something, you ask who, what, where, why, and how. So we're going to quickly skip over those because I'm aware of the time and I want to make sure you have time for questions. So, the who. At Beaumont, we give all students an assistive technology assessment. There isn't any kind of precursor to that where we say, oh, these people do, these people don't. We make sure that, at very least for students, that initial observation is done and the initial AT assessment is done. A lot of times that might result in, well, no further input is required at this stage. And that student stays on an assistive technologist caseload, but they don't necessarily require input until we observe something different or until maybe their needs change. For the what we do, we've covered that in the process session, we've been through that. Now where, now this can be quite important, where do you do your assessments? If at all possible, we like to do that within the context of a teaching session. And this is especially useful for students who have got a lot of technology use in their studies. So we will do that if at all possible within the teaching session, try not to disturb that. But if need be, we'll bring the individual into this room and timetable some time in. So if they need a distraction-free environment, that could be really, really critical, that they can come out of the session and come into here. Now that's really key for things like if someone's developing their skill with eye gaze, or you're testing out where they're using they can use an eye gaze system. What you don't want is them being distracted by people moving around the room and other noises. So we bring them into here where it's distraction-free and relatively quiet. The other possibility is in that setting it might be distracting to other students. So if you're developing a cause and effect skill with someone on a switch and they like loud music, and they like loud noises as their motivation, then we don't want to do that in a setting in the setting of a teaching session initially, because it's just going to annoy the other students. We'll also timetable students into the assessment room if they've got a complex skill to develop, and again, for that targeted short burst skill development, which then they can shift to use that within the context. So as soon as possible, we'll try and shift any of that skill development and have them use it in a more meaningful context within the teaching session. So when will we do assessments? Well, obviously, we do the assessment as early as possible after the student joins college. We want to make sure they've got the tools they need to continue with their studies. However, some students may not be ready, so we will always observe students, and we may then, within conversations with tutors and with other professionals, be aware that that student may be coming to a new environment. There's lots of new people, it's totally different from school or somewhere they've been before. So we need to make sure that they've got the ability, are able to show their ability and do that. So a good example of this might be at the minute, there's a student who started in September, and he has really high levels of anxiety because he's not used to the environment, he's not used to college as a setup. Now, we think long term that he's going to benefit from using voice recognition software, but at the minute, A, he won't engage with that, and B, we don't want to give him something else to increase his level of anxiety. So in conversation with his tutor, we are waiting for that, and he's using other methods of engaging with technology. And then when it gets to a point where hopefully his anxieties have settled, then we can bring that in. So it's not always the best thing to do that an intensive assessment early. It's always going to be dependent on the individual. The why? Well, it's pretty obvious. I don't think you'd be here today if you didn't think there was a purpose behind doing assistive technology assessment. So let's skip over that one. The how. We've talked through the process earlier. I want to introduce you, if you don't know it, to a really useful book, which is free. You don't need to buy it. You can download it. It's produced by the Wisconsin Assistive Technology Service, and it's called How Do You Know It? How Can You Show It? And this has been really critical to the way in which I assess. I'm just going to pull it up on the screen now to show you. So I know it. Show it. So how do you know it? How can you show it? If you don't get the link off the screen, we can email out to you, or you just search for how do you know it? How can you show it? You can download the PDF. What it does is it puts takes the context of assistive technology and describes the importance of using data and hard evidence to back up your assessments. It's too easy to be able to do an assessment and then to go on things like gut feeling or trying something out. Now, obviously, for straightforward assessments and where the student or individual can give you a lot of feedback, that's fine, because you can try that out. If it's something more complex, like someone learning to use a switch, or you're trying to decide between two different switch positions for that individual, you need some data to back that up. So you need to be able to create some recording where you might be using the switch in a particular position, recording how successful they are at using a piece of software. Then using the same piece of software and a different switch position, you're again recording how successful that is. That enables you to make a valid decision, and again, it enables you to examine that data later and to get somebody else to be able to look at that data and see what they think. I would say using video alongside that. But here's a good example of one that we might use. Beaumont, which is just a simple tick sheet for a switch activity. So this is for a young man at Beaumont who's developing his switch scanning skills, and we want to know whether he's selecting the switch at the right time given the prompt. So he has the scanning of the tune Shake It Off, he's got some fiddle music, and then he's got white noise. Now we know that he's motivated by both Shake It Off as a piece of music and fiddle music he likes to dance along to. White noise he's not that keen on. But what we want to know is actually, is he selecting at the right time to make an appropriate choice? I'd encourage you, if you do anything like this, any kind of data collection, keep it simple, because a lot of the time people filling this in aren't going to be wanting writing reams and reams. You might be leaving it with a member of staff who's supporting that student, and then they're able to just tick the amount of times that they selected Shake It Off instead of fiddle music, and then if need be can write some additional notes at the bottom if there was anything, if the student was ill, for instance, or the individual concerned was not reacting in a totally different way, then that can be dealt with in the notes. Okay, keeping one eye on the time, I'm aware I'm overrunning slightly, so let's just jump back to slideshow. Okay, so we're also under the how. We really want to encourage people to think about continuous assessment. A one-stop shop for assessment, especially for someone with complex needs, is never going to work. It always needs revisiting. There's always going to be times for people with complex needs where they might have a physical change. It might be something as straightforward as they've changed their wheelchair and suddenly things are in a different position, or their body is in a different position. Reassessment's often required. It might also be that something outside of that individual, their context has changed. They've started studying a different subject, so they need access to different resources. So a reassessment might be required at that point. Hopefully it's more simple than the initial assessment, but not always. So, other considerations, and this is the big one, personal preference. So on the top right of your screen there, you see something that's called a Maltron keyboard. Really amazing device, really useful device if you're typing with one hand. It's designed for one-handed typists. That one's designed for a left-handed typist. It's a totally different typing system. It also is probably about as big. It's about 30 centimeters by 30 by 20 or something. It's a big piece of kit. I've seen countless individuals who may well benefit from a Maltron keyboard reject it because they don't like the look of it. They don't want to learn a new method of typing. They don't want, if they're a 17, 18-year-old, they don't want to be seen dead with a piece of kit that looks like that. So we've always got those other considerations to bear in mind. For some people, it might just be the colour. It might be the design. It might be something that they can't even put their finger on, but they just don't want to use that piece of kit. Obviously, if it's the only solution for that person to access stuff, we need to work on persuading them and giving them an opportunity. But if there are alternatives, then we will do that. And sometimes people will struggle on with something that isn't ideal for them because that is their preference. And as an assistive technologist, I have to be mindful of that, and I have to make sure that that individual gets a chance to express their preference. Otherwise, they're just not going to use the kit. They'll just sit in the cupboard, holding it down. iPads are another key example of that. On the flip side, on the positive side, people who wouldn't want to carry around a really big, clunky communication aid, for instance, are now quite happy to carry around an iPad because they can sit in a cafe or a pub and it looks exactly the same as anyone else just sat in a pub using an iPad. And for some individuals, that's really critical. Just bringing you back, even though we have already talked about it a lot, back to the context. make sure you're taking the context into account when you're business. So, in summary, we've talked about the process, we've been through what we do here and the way in which we do it. I'm not saying that's right, I'm not saying it's a perfect process, I'm just letting you know that's what works for us, and maybe it's something, a starting point if you're beginning looking at assistive technology assessment. Equipment being key, your range of equipment is key to your assessment and the ability to be able to do that. And with techniques, well, we've just been through that, so I'm not going to remind you of that. So, I'm aware I've talked for far too long. We've gone over the hour, but if you're willing to hang around, does anyone have any questions?
Phil, hi, thank you very much indeed. That was really, really interesting. We've got one question from Richard Bright that was asked sometime previously when you were talking about the assessment, and the question is, who has the overview at Beaumont and who carries out the overall assessment?
Interesting question, Richard. When it comes to assistive technology, the person that has the overview is that individual's assistive technologist. So each technologist has a caseload, and they are the person responsible, but they are responsible for bringing all those other professionals together. Now, it's not quite that simple, because obviously alongside our assessments, the OT will be doing their own assessments and their own observations. The physio will be, the SLT will be. But a lot of time, the assistive technologist will sit in the middle as a hub for all those people, because a lot of what we do then impacts on what the tutor's doing. It impacts on what the OT might be doing, because we're saying, oh, well, you might mount that piece of kit, but that's going to get in the way of their switch, and therefore they then can't communicate. So it's hard to say who has the overview, but that's one of the reasons why we have that community of practice, because we know that then there's a time that we can all get together and we can bat around these ideas, and we can make sure that we're meeting the needs of the students by discussing those with all the people who might be involved.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from any of the delegates? I've not got any in the question box on my screen. Oh, thank you, Neil, and hello to your colleagues from Croatia, from Greece, and from Finland. It's been fantastic that you've been able to join us. And yes, we'll make sure that we get the recording and the presentations out to yourselves. Thank you very much, Chris, that you were able to join us. Okay, I'm going to take back presenter privileges now and just finish off. Okay, thank you very much again, Phil, for that really, really interesting presentation. The recording will be available after the webinar, and we'll make sure that the resources are made available to yourselves as well. And there's just some brief information in the presentation that I will distribute around different ways of keeping in touch with work that's going on across the Karten network. And there we go again, just ways of keeping in touch with us. And a reminder that our next webinar will be on the 30th of November, which is next Thursday at 12:30, and this will be coming from Beacon Centre in Wolverhampton, where our presenter will be Matt Harrison, and he's going to demonstrate different technologies that are used for people with visual impairment. So we hope you can join us next week, and thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Good night and have a pleasant evening. Bye-bye.